For my money, Tony Bennett is the best singer in the business. The words hang in the room, and the room freezes around them. A single overhead lamp throws a cone of yellow light across a low table. A reel-to-reel tape recorder keeps turning, the two spools ticking past each other in a slow, patient rhythm. A man in a grey suit leans back in a leather chair, hands loose in his lap, not smiling, not performing, just stating a fact the way other men state the weather, or the time or the score of last night's game. Wait, before we go any further, you need to understand something about that sentence. It wasn't a compliment tossed off to fill a pause in an interview. In 1965, that single line, 8 words, maybe 9 depending on how you count them, was about to travel from a tape recorder in a Manhattan office to a career 300 miles away that was quietly, almost silently coming apart at the seams. The man who said it was Frank Sinatra. The singer he said it about was Tony Bennett. And at the exact moment those words were spoken into a microphone, Bennett had no idea they existed. He was standing in the wings of a room that used to sell out, watching it not sell out anymore. This is how it happened. New York City. 1965, the Life magazine offices on the 6th floor smell like cigarette smoke, hot mimeograph ink, and the particular staleness of coffee that's been sitting on a hot plate since 8 that morning. Down the hall, typewriters clatter in a rhythm nobody in the building even hears anymore. It's just the sound of a Tuesday. A young research assistant moves through that noise carrying a single sheet of yellow copy paper. She's 23 years old, 3 months into the job. The kind of position where you fetch coffee, file contact sheets, and pray nobody remembers your name long enough to fire you. The page in her hand is a freshly typed transcript, Sinatra's interview from that morning, with pencil marks already crawling up the left margin where an editor has started crossing things out. She doesn't know yet that this page is going to end up folded in the back of her desk drawer for the next 11 years, because column inches are tight that week. There's a war escalating overseas that's eating half the front section. There's a civil rights story running long that nobody upstairs wants trimmed. And a celebrity profile, however big the celebrity, is exactly the kind of thing that gets cut first when space runs short. Which quotes are we keeping? The senior editor asks, not even looking up from the layout board, a cigarette burning down between 2 fingers. There's a line in here about Bennett, the assistant says, holding up the yellow page. It's good. It's more than good. Good doesn't fit in an inch and a half. Sweetheart, she doesn't argue. She's 23. And arguing with a man twice her age about magazine layout is not a fight anyone hands her the authority to win. So she does something smaller instead. She folds the yellow page once, lengthwise, along a crease that will still be visible on it a decade later, and slides it into the pocket of her cardigan. The quote gets cut from the final layout. She at least wants one copy of it to exist somewhere that isn't a wastebasket by 5 o'clock. Stay with me here, because that fold in that pocket is the whole story, quietly waiting to matter. The interview itself had happened only a few hours earlier, 1 floor up, in a smaller office with better chairs and a view of the avenue. The reporter, a soft-spoken man with a legal pad, glasses pushed up on his forehead, and a habit of asking one question too many, had been circling for 20 minutes around the usual territory. New album, next film, Vegas schedule. Standard stuff, the kind of answers a man like Sinatra could give in his sleep. Then he tried something different. Nobody's asked me this in a while, Sinatra said, before the question was even fully out of the reporter's mouth. Most people ask what I'm recording next. Nobody asks who I'm listening to. All right, the reporter said, sensing something shifting in the room. So who are you listening to, Mr. Sinatra? He didn't answer right away. He reached for the glass on the table beside him, didn't drink from it, just turned it once, slow, watching the ice catch the lamplight. That pause is the locked object doing its quiet work before it's even fully in the room. Not the glass itself, but the half-second of consideration before he hands something over. There's a kid, Sinatra finally said. Well, what, not a kid anymore. Hasn't been for a long time. Bennett. Tony Bennett. Here's what nobody sitting in that office that afternoon knew. Not the reporter, not the editor pacing his layout board, not even the 23-year-old with a folded yellow page, now sitting warm against her hip. While Sinatra was saying Bennett's name into a tape recorder in Manhattan, Bennett himself was 300 miles away, standing in a hallway outside a club that used to be packed on a Tuesday night, watching a business that had belonged to men like him get quietly handed over to a completely different sound. So now there are two questions sitting on top of each other, and neither one has an answer yet. First, will this line even survive the editor's red pencil, or does it end up on the floor of a New York office with 100 other good lines that didn't make the cut that week? And second, the one that actually matters. Does Tony Bennett have any idea at all, that a sentence like this is about to exist? He doesn't. Nobody has told him. Nobody's going to tell him. He is going to find out the same way the rest of the country does, by opening a magazine. Hold this moment, because what happens next isn't backstory dressed up as trivia. It's a scene, and it's unfolding in real time. In the same afternoon hours, the tape recorder is still turning uptown. Bennett is standing just off a small stage, in a hallway that smells like stale beer and cigarette smoke from the night before. His name is still up on the marquee outside, still spelled correctly, still lit. But by 1965, the ground underneath men like him has shifted fast. Traditional pop singers, the ones who built careers on saloon songs and full orchestras, on tuxedos and a single spotlight, are being pushed toward the edges of a stage that suddenly belongs to guitars, to younger faces, to a British sound that arrived almost overnight and never left. A club manager leans in the doorway beside him, heavy-set, checked sport coat, an unlit cigar rolling between two fingers, the kind of man who thinks he's being kind when he isn't. Behind him, through the half-open door, you can see the room itself, a scattering of tables where there used to be a wall-to-wall crowd, and a bandstand set up for an orchestra that tonight will play to more empty chairs than filled ones. "Still get a nice crowd in here, Tony," he says. "Older folks, loyal ones." Older folks is manager speak for fewer folks, and Bennett knows exactly what's being said underneath the sentence. He nods anyway, because there's nothing to say back that doesn't sound like arguing with arithmetic. He doesn't complain about it. Not that night, not in interviews for years afterward, not ever, really. That's simply not who he is, and it never will be, even decades later when people ask him directly about this exact stretch of his career. But there's a particular kind of quiet that settles over a performer who used to fill rooms and now watches them half fill instead. It isn't despair, and it isn't self-pity. It's just numbers, and numbers don't soften themselves for anybody, no matter how good you are at what you do. He walks back toward the dressing room past a row of framed photographs on the wall. Himself, 10 years younger, in front of a packed house that doesn't exist for him anymore. Not on a Tuesday, not like this. He doesn't stop to look at them. He's looked at them enough times already. Inside the dressing room, his accompanist is already at the upright piano in the corner, running scales quietly, half out of habit, and half to fill the silence. Bennett sits down across from the mirror, loosens his tie one notch, and says nothing for a long moment. Then, almost to himself more than to anyone else in the room, they still come, just fewer of them each time. The accompanist doesn't stop playing. He just nods, the way you nod at something true that neither of you particularly wants to sit with for too long. Back uptown, in the room with the lamp and the turning reel-to-reel, the reporter leans forward, sensing there's weight behind Sinatra's sentence that a passing compliment simply wouldn't carry. "You mean that as a professional opinion?" he asks. "Or as a friend talking about a friend?" "Both," Sinatra says. "Write it down exactly the way I say it." "Exactly how, Mr. Sinatra?" He doesn't hesitate, doesn't soften it, doesn't reach for the glass again. He says it clean, the way a man says something he's thought 100 times privately, but never had a reason to hand to a stranger with a notepad. "For my money, Tony Bennett is the best singer in the business. He excites me when I watch him. He moves me. He's the singer who gets across what the composer has in mind, and probably a little more." The reporter's pen stops moving for a second, hovering above the page. It isn't the flattery that stops him. Plenty of stars hand out flattery in interviews, most of it forgotten by the time the ink is dry. It's who is saying it. Sinatra isn't a man known for handing out praise like that loosely, and everyone in that small room understands, without a single word passing between them, that they've just watched something rare happen. "Say that again," the reporter says quietly. Almost embarrassed to ask, Sinatra says it again, word for word, exactly the same the second time, which tells you everything about how long he'd already been carrying that sentence around before anyone thought to ask him for it. Notice what happens here. One sentence, spoken twice, by a man who almost never gave sentences like this away for free, and an entire career 300 miles south is about to tilt on its axis without even knowing it yet. Back in the layout room, the editor reads the transcript late that afternoon, cigarette burned down to the filter. Red pencil hovering over the Bennett line one more time. This one stays, he finally says, almost to himself. Cut something else. Nobody argues. Nobody has to. The assistant, still carrying the folded yellow page in her cardigan pocket out of habit now rather than necessity, doesn't even mention that she'd already saved a copy. It was never about being right. It was about making sure that if the world lost this sentence for a day, at least one person hadn't. Weeks later, the issue hits newsstands across the country. Bennett, by his own account, told and retold for decades afterward on stages and in interviews, picks up a copy the way anyone does, flipping past the war coverage, past the ads for cigarettes and station wagons, until he lands on his own name sitting inside someone else's profile. He reads it once. Then again, slower, the way you reread a sentence you're not sure you're allowed to believe yet. For my money, Tony Bennett is the best singer in the business. Bennett would say later that this sentence didn't just flatter him, it rescued him. Rooms that had been quietly going dark started filling again. Bookings that had gone cold started ringing back to life. People who had never once thought about Tony Bennett picked up a magazine, read one man's opinion of another man, and decided that if Frank Sinatra said this fellow was the best in the business, they better go see for themselves what all the fuss was about. And here, finally, is where the locked object opens all the way. That folded yellow page in the assistant's cardigan pocket. She kept it. Not for a week, not for a year. For over a decade, moved from desk drawer to desk drawer, through 2 different apartments, long after she'd left the magazine for another job entirely. She never told Bennett she had it. She never needed his thanks, and she never went looking for a way to use it. It wasn't about credit. It was about the plain fact that for one ordinary Tuesday afternoon, she had been standing in a small room where a sentence was born. A sentence that would go on to outlive the magazine issue it was printed in, outlive the editor who nearly cut it for space, and outlive both men who spoke it and lived inside it for the rest of their lives. Bennett, for his part, never knew a research assistant had folded that page into her pocket rather than let it disappear into a wastebasket. He only ever knew the finished version, and the one that made it to newsstands, the one strangers quoted back to him in the years that followed, sometimes word for word, the way people do with sentences that matter to them. Years later, decades. Really, Tony Bennett is still telling this story himself. On stages, in television interviews, in his own words, he calls it the moment that changed his whole career, the sentence that turned around bookings that had gone quiet and rooms that had gone half empty. He would go on to say that he and Sinatra stayed close for the rest of Frank's life, that Frank was, in his own words, his best friend, even though Bennett was never part of the famous crowd of men who orbited Sinatra through Vegas in those years. Their friendship, it turns out, lived somewhere quieter than that, somewhere closer to one sentence spoken honestly in a room with a tape recorder running, somewhere in a box that outlasted the filing cabinet it once sat in, which outlasted the offices it once sat inside of. That yellow page may still exist, one typed sentence, a few pencil marks crossed out in the margin, and the quiet fingerprint of a 23-year-old who understood, faster than anyone else standing in that room that day, that she wasn't simply filing paperwork. She was holding the reason a man's career didn't end in 1965. Some sentences are just sentences, spoken and forgotten by dinner time. And some sentences turn out to be the whole hinge a life quietly turns on. And you don't always get to know which kind you're holding until years afterward, when someone tells the story of it themselves on a stage decades later. Still grateful. That's the story of one sentence, spoken by a man who almost never gave sentences like it away. That quietly saved a career nobody else in the business was willing to save out loud. Has anyone ever said something about you, almost in passing, almost as an aside, that ended up changing everything that came after it? I'd love to hear that story in the comments below. If you enjoyed spending this time here with me, I'd be grateful if you'd consider subscribing. The next story I want to tell you is about a night the lights in a recording studio went dark on purpose. and what Sinatra did in that darkness. In what came out sounding like nearly one single take,